So, Stephen Shalowitz, host of the One Way Ticket Show, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
It's great to be aboard your show. Thanks so much for the invitation.
So, we were connected through Jennifer, is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And you were working, you're in a mastermind together, or is that, tell me a little bit about the program where you met her.
You know what? You've got me on that one because I think we were in a mastermind together quite some time ago.
Yeah.
And I believe we've both left the mastermind. At least I know I did.
Yeah.
But the great thing about those types of gatherings is that you always get to meet great people, like-minded people, and many of them I've stayed in contact with. So Jennifer being one of them. So we want to give her a shout out
Yes.
for connecting us. Yes. Thank you,
I was
Jennifer.
just on a call with her. We're working on a launch for a podcast client, and we're partnering together, and we're building a network of shows with her magazine work that she does. So she's been top of mind recently.
Yeah, she's
Yeah.
lovely and she's a very creative person and just really great to speak with. So send her my best
Yes, I
regards.
will. So, how do you think about this idea of self improvement? And are you always looking at that as an option? You know, some people read, do courses, online courses, or join masterminds. So, as you've moved, you know, you were in advertising for a long period of time, and we'll get into that. But as you started to make the move into the world of entrepreneur, podcast host, realizing the things that you did and didn't know. I went through this exact same experience when I started my show in 2014. I read that Jim Rohn quote that you are the average of the five people you spend the most time with. And so I quickly realized the things that I didn't learn in university or in my corporate world. So, how do you think about that? And what was that journey for you in terms of discovery of where you needed more help in terms of learning those types of things?
Sure, I think there's actually a couple of threads there
Yeah.
that I can probably pick up on. And I think one of them was the first thing that you mentioned, which is this whole notion of self-improvement. And for me, I think every day should be a day of self-improvement for all of us.
Mm.
And I think that there are a lot of people out there, and God bless them for doing this, but there are a lot of people that say, I'm going to join a mastermind, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to read this book, because once I read the book, then I'm going to know everything that I need to know. Or once I join this particular gathering of five other people or whatever it is. In other words, people like to have that all institutionalized, or if I listen to this podcast, this is going to make me a better person. And I think those avenues can certainly help. But I think that having an approach to saying that every day is about self improvement, every day is about saying the world isn't black and white, it's very gray, and every day being open up to possibilities is a day for self improvement.
Mm.
So that's the first thing. However, you come to it, just be open to the possibilities of what self improvement can be all about. It can be a conversation with somebody that you meet on the street or in the subway. I live here in New York, so a lot of subway riding for me, but it can be about, and it can come really from almost anything. So I think there's that. And then in terms of my case, at least in terms of being a podcaster, I mean, I don't know how far back we want to go because I started the One Way Ticket Show back in 2012,
Yeah.
but the antecedents to the One Way Ticket Show were when I was doing a radio show when I lived in Singapore.
Yeah.
So, for the benefit of the listeners, I lived in Asia for 16 years, all over China. And in Singapore, I worked in advertising for Young and Rubicam, one of the biggies, all over China and in Singapore. The weekend I had a radio show in Singapore. It was first a jazz show, then Latin music and lifestyle, and then I also did the world music channel and the Latin music channels for Singapore Airlines in flight. And I say this because in the course of these conversations, or in the course of all of this programming, I got to interview a lot of celebrities. And one day I was on the bus, and if you have any listeners that have either been to Singapore or live in Singapore, I was on Beach Road where our office was, and I was taking the bus. And I remember sitting there and saying to myself, wow, I wonder where all these celebs would go if I gave them a one-way ticket, no coming back.
Yeah.
And that was the kernel of the idea for my show. I knew I was going to move back to the US. So I said one day I will do a whole show around it. So the reason I tell you all of this as background is that doing my show and the One Way Ticket Show and starting that podcast back in 2012 when people did not know what a
Hmm.
podcast was and I had to explain to people what a podcast was, the learning curve was enormous for me. And when you talk about self improvement, going back to your question, and we talk about learning every day, every interview was an experience in how to really do this. I had plenty of radio experience and plenty of experience in terms of interviewing people. But podcasting was a different medium in terms of, especially in those days and in the early years, of getting yourself known and getting your show known and getting your show out there. And that was difficult. And dare I say, even though it's funny because while there weren't a lot of podcasts then, and there weren't a lot of podcasts then, and so in a way, it could be easier to get your show out there and listened to. Now, there are so many podcasts out there. It's just the reverse, and it's more difficult to get your show known and out there because, again, just the proliferation, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, in a way, in and of itself, is a good thing. So for me, the learnings didn't come so much from interviewing people, et cetera, in terms of the art of interviewing, because I had a lot of experience doing that. Although I will say one is learning every single episode that one does. But I'm talking about the real learning curve. The real learning curve for me has always been just the marketing of the show and the getting it out there and the change of times that we're living in to get it out there. So I hope I answered your
You
question.
did. You answered it very eloquently, and it's clear your experience behind the mic. And for the benefit of the listener, it's interesting to see how you're able to hold the thread of the question that was originally asked. And we're getting inside baseball here in terms of podcast and hosting, which is what fascinates me and why I love to have this show. And just to see how everyone handles these conversations. I notice myself when being interviewed sometimes I decide to, am I wearing my podcast guest hat or am I my host hat? Do I want to jump in and take over the conversation? And I'm always
And
wary.
let's face it, isn't it easier to be the host because you're in the driver's seat?
Yeah, you can control the flow. So many threads there to pull, so I'm going to try to manage some of them. Let's start with New York because that's, where my heart is. I grew up in Yonkers, New York, and I lived in the city. I lived in East Village, I lived in Greenpoint, I lived in the Upper East Side, so it holds a special place in my heart. And then moved out in 2014, lived in LA of all places for 4 years, and then now home is Minnesota, so the Midwest, and I know that you have a connection to the Midwest as well.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm a third generation Chicagoan. And when people ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from Chicago, but I live in New York.
yeah,
And the funny thing is, I've lived in New York since 2006.
yeah. And so a lot has happened in New York, right? I
Yeah.
was there for 9/11. I lived in the East Village. And I'm curious, being a New Yorker, I was also there for Hurricane Sandy to experience that blackout there. So naturally, as someone who makes their way there, you've lived there as long as you have, you develop a connection to a city in a way that's hard to explain for people that are not from there or have not spent time there. It's an energy, it's a vibe. And so, what is, if you think about who you were prior to moving to New York City and then the life that you lived there and the experiences that you had there, the highs and the lows, how do you explain to someone what it's like living in New York City?
Can I just pick up though on something that you said that you become connected to a city and it
Yeah.
becomes a part of you, what you were saying? Because for me, one of the cities that I lived in when I was in China was Beijing. And I don't want to date myself, so I don't even want to tell you the first time I lived in Beijing or the first time I went to Beijing when I was a student. However, I did live there from 90, 91 to through 94. And then I lived in Guangzhou and then I lived in Shanghai and I lived in Hong Kong before that, and then I moved back to Singapore. Beijing for me was like a second home, and the city has changed exponentially. But the last time I was there was in 2012, and I went back to my old neighborhood and my old haunts, and there's just this visceral feeling that you get, or at least I get, from living there because I speak Chinese and it's the accent, the Beijing accent is so endearing to me on a number of levels because my first Chinese teacher taught us to speak with a Beijing accent
Okay.
and it's very sing-song. So I have this visceral connection to Beijing. I also have a very visceral connection to Singapore where I lived for 9 years. So, but in terms of New York, one thing that I tell people is that even though it is a huge city, and I live in Manhattan, I'm on the Upper West Side, I say even though it is a very big city, it is still a very small town because New York City is made up as many cities are really, I mean, Chicago is as well. New York City is made up of little neighborhoods, and each sort of few block radius is a very different feel than the next few block radius. And where I live, for example, and it's so funny that you're bringing this up because I think about this every day. When I walk down West 72nd Street to go to either Trader Joe's or Fairway, which is the grocery store, or I go to the gym, I think to myself, what a lovely little neighborhood this is.
Mm,
I pass by the bodega owner that I wave to. I pass by the guys that, in the barber shop. I pass by the doorman, and we all, the butcher, we all know each other,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because we see each other every day. There are the couple of people that sit outside the bakery and that have their coffee every morning. We always say hello to each other. I don't know their names. They
yeah.
don't know my name, but it's this sense of neighborhood. And so that's what I like to tell people is that New York is this city full of neighborhoods. And even though it's this huge metropolis, it is still a very neighborhood centric and neighborhood focused kind of city.
Do you feel it changed after COVID? Because I was there recently. I went to visit my folks. Went up to Yonkers for a bit, and we decided to poke our head into the city for a night. And
Next time you got to come say hello.
I will definitely. And I think because I live in an environment that's a very different. We're about 30 minutes outside of Minneapolis, and I can tell you that in the morning, I wake up in the morning and I see trees because we abut a swamp that was bought out by the neighbors so that no one could ever develop there. So you wake up seeing that. I see it. There's been the occasional buck or deer that runs through the yard. Turkeys pass through all the neighbors' yards. Our neighbors have chickens, which we have to watch when they're on vacation. So for me, as a city slicker, if you will, like to have the ability to kind of settle down and not have sirens in the background when you're falling asleep, which was, I thought,
Or when you're recording a podcast.
I used to brag about how I could, oh my God, I could sleep through anything and sleep through a siren. And I remember the first time I left the city for an extended period of time, I was like, whoa, it's so quiet. But I think now what I'm used to now is interesting to see how being in this environment and then going back into the city, it felt a bit different, this time, to be honest. It's just a bit of more frenetic energy, if you will.
Yeah, it can feel very jarring when you're going from a very quiet place to the city because there is a lot of energy. One of the things that I do love about living here is that you don't need a car. You can really walk almost anywhere you need to walk to. That's to say, if you're living in Manhattan or at least the central part of Manhattan, if you will. And I love the fact that I could be at Lincoln Center. I could walk to Lincoln Center in a matter of minutes. In fact, my previous apartment, I could have a ticket to a performance at Lincoln Center, and it would take me just as long to wait for the elevator, go down, because I was on the 36th floor, to wait for the elevator. Was I on the 36th floor or 37th floor? I can't
That's high.
remember now even, but I was high. But I was on the 30 something floor. I would go down. It would take me longer to almost get down in the elevator and wait for the elevator than it would to walk over to Lincoln Center. And, just to have that, to have all the cultural institutions at your doorstep is just phenomenal. And to have Central Park right here is also just extraordinary. And you asked the question how New York has changed since COVID. It has and it hasn't, because New York, I think, is a city of constant change.
Yeah,
So it's almost like saying, how did it change from, I'm making this up, 1985 to 90, 90 to 95, 90.
sure.
I will say, though, a lot of businesses have closed,
Yeah.
very sadly. The homeless problem has become even more acute.
Mm-hmm.
Restaurants have closed. Some restaurants, of course, have opened for outdoor dining,
Mm.
which is a nice thing. But then, of course, there are more rats on the street. And of course, the big thing, without getting into politics, is, and it has nothing to do with COVID, but it's over the last, I guess, year or so, is the amount of pot smoking and
Mm.
public,
Oh, yeah.
because cannabis became legalized.
Yeah.
And so the city is awash in pot. And it drives me absolutely crazy. And it's a whole big subject for me because, if we're told to follow the science, and unfortunately, I've had reason to go to the hospital for a number of things over the last since the beginning part of the year and all over the Weill Cornell area. It's no smoking, no smoking, no smoking, and you see all these signs for no smoking. We're smoke-free environment, so it's like that's the science, yet our lawmakers that are telling us to follow the
Yeah.
science aren't following the science themselves because they just want to make a buck and tax the pot. In the meantime, you get a bunch of drugged out people all over the city. The whole city smells like pot, and it's a rather unfortunate byproduct of what I think our misguided policies.
Mm.
But again, I know this isn't a political show, and we can have that conversation perhaps offline, or if people want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to share more context with them.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Yeah, it is a touchy subject, and you kind of see it. It's happening here because it just got legalized in
Yeah.
Minneapolis as well. And even smaller towns, we live in a town called Shorewood. The council is like struggling to figure out what to do. Do we like ban it and like by the water because there's tons of lakes here and there's kids there and just like what to do. And so I think every location is struggling to figure out what to do. We're sort of a Wild West moment now.
Well, when you talk about kids, let me just say, in my previous building, the one that I mentioned, I was on the 30-something floor, which I can't remember the floor now. On more than one occasion, there's a high school not far from that building, and there was a plaza in front of the building where I lived. And so you get the high schoolers smoking pot in front of there, and the pot smell would just waft into the lobby of the building, and all the little ones would be waiting to be picked up to go to kindergarten, daycare, school, and they'd have to inhale all of this. So I'm thinking to myself,
Wow.
where are we not following the science? And for all these government officials that are saying it's all about the kids,
Yeah.
well, is it really about the kids? Because you haven't thought this through.
Yeah. That's really what we're
What
seeing.
I think they should do, and I spoke to my assemblywoman about this because she had a meet and greet outside, and she got quite an earful from me, shall we say. And she basically threw up her hands and said, "Well, what do you want us to do?" I said, "You know what you need to do?" I said, "You need to do what they do in airports." I said, "You have these little smoking cubes." I said, "Anyone that wants to go smoke pot, God bless them. Let them go in these smoking cubes, let them smoke themselves into oblivion, and then when they're ready, they can come out, be all drugged up as you want to be, but I at least don't have to smell that stuff."
Yeah, I always used to walk by those pods in the airport and just see all these people in there in a cloud of smoke. I'm
Yeah,
just like,
exactly.
yeah, that can't be healthy.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background. Obviously, you spent a lot of
Yeah, we
time.
got a long way off of podcasting.
That's what I love about it, though. You just kind of pull all the threads together because everything that you're experiencing is colors you and your
Yeah.
life, and obviously, there's no way you can have it not feed into the thoughts you have, the perceptions you have, the opinions you have, and that colors you as a host. And as you have conversations on podcasts or with your guests, it all becomes like a part of who you are. And so, in advertising, did you know you wanted to get into advertising when you were in university or when you were younger?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
It was the last thing that I wanted to do. I never considered it. What happened was ancient history here. So I studied Chinese language and literature as an undergrad, and people thought I was building a spaceship in my garage when I told them I was studying Chinese because that was 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And nobody was studying Chinese at that point. I mean, of course, there were people studying Chinese, but very, very few. I mean, there were four of us. I went to Washington University in St. Louis undergrad. There were four of us that graduated with a degree that year in Chinese. So, to put it into context, and then I went to Johns Hopkins to do my master's in international relations. So originally, I wanted to go into either the Foreign Service or international broadcast journalism,
Okay.
and I had done an internship at CNN, for example, while I was in graduate school. And I always knew I wanted to go into communications. That would be one thing that I would want to do. But I always wanted to have a China focus and I wanted to do something with China. So I had a Rotary Foundation scholarship to move to Singapore after graduate school for more Chinese language study. Then I moved to Hong Kong in search of my China job because I wanted a China job, largely in communications. And originally I was going to go into PR because I liked the discipline of PR in terms of the writing, the change of perception from an editorial environment. It wasn't just about, someone's having a concert and we got to promote it or, that kind of fluff. I'd like the more strategic angle in public relations, crisis management, and
Mm,
so on. And I thought at the time it would really be a fascinating area to go into vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis East Asia, using my background, my language skills, and so on. And I was interviewing for a job in public relations with Burson Marsteller. I can give them a shout out. But the gentleman that was running Burson Marsteller for China also was running Young and Rubicam for China. And 20 minutes into the interview, he said, "I'm willing to offer you a job." And then I basically said yes. And then I said to his number two person, "Are you offering me a job in PR or advertising?" He said, "Advertising." And I said, "Okay, I'll take it," just because I wanted to stay in Asia
Yeah.
and work with China and in the communications industry. As it turns out, it worked out very well for me because I got to live in a number of Chinese cities and I was working in advertising as China was moving towards a market economy. And of course, advertising is one of the vehicles there. And so to work in that environment where, I mean, when we were hiring people, basically, if they could speak some English and had a pulse, we hired them because they didn't know anything about advertising. I did not study advertising, yet I grew up in a market economy. And of course, I grew up with ads.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
being a bit of a TV junkie,
Yeah.
podcast junkie, TV
Yeah.
junkie, I'm also a podcast junkie, but, being a bit of a TV junkie, I was able to, learn a little bit about advertising through looking at them and so on. Anyway, so that's how it all happened. So I never intended on going into the field. Absolutely not. But I learned a heck of a lot.
Yeah, I would
And I had
imagine.
great clients along the way.
How is your perspective about the function of advertising and marketing changed over the years, especially when you went into it at a moment when I'm sure there was a lot of excitement about what was possible. You're in new markets, and then you watch a show like Mad Men and you get to see the glamorous side of what happens in there.
Right.
Position for you evolved in retrospect when you look back at how the power that marketing has to shift people's buying habits and maybe get them to buy something that maybe they don't need.
Sure.
And so as you think about looking at it, having been in it, belly of the beast, and then coming out of it and now looking back at it, and how has that evolved in your mind, and what role does it serve now from
Well,
your perspective?
sure. Well, let me just say, take the first part of your question because you have to understand, I was not working in New York at
Yeah.
the time of big expense accounts
Yeah.
and three martini lunches and, everything's very glamorous. I was working really in the trenches in China and that was tough. And talking about having a whole separate conversation about pot smoking and, here in New York, I could have a whole, discourse about what it was like working in China in the 90s versus what it's like today,
Yeah.
okay, or
Yeah.
even living. So I was in a completely different environment. I mean, at one point I was sent down because Colgate was one of my clients.
Sure.
At one point I was sent down to Vietnam to launch Colgate toothpaste in China. So again, to be able to work in that environment, really in the trenches, I mean, there was I had to physically go to Ho Chi Minh TV with media plans. I had to find a media buyer even to begin with. And you
Wow.
had companies, for example, that weren't doing just media buying, they were doing media buying and they were selling air conditioners. Okay. I mean, this is like the range. It was such the Wild West throughout that whole time in these developing markets. So I was totally immune from anything glamorous that was even going on. Okay. So there's that. So I can't answer that part. However, I will say that advertising was seen to be as a very glamorous industry. I think it was a very exciting industry and still is because even just making a TV commercial, it's like making a little movie. I
Mm-hmm.
actually liked a lot of the behind the scenes bits of it
Yeah.
because it involves so many different disciplines, not only a TV commercial, but also when you're working in account management, it requires your brain to be just stretched in so many different ways because you take a very helicopter approach to a client's piece of business and you touch sales, you touch marketing, you touch the consumer, you just touch on so many packaging, for example, insights and
Yeah.
so much. You touch so many different disciplines that it's a very exciting industry. Having said that, though, it's changed an awful lot in terms of an industry. So much has become gone online. I find that when I look at ads today, I don't find that there's any real central idea behind the advertising. I think a lot of it's wallpaper
Mm.
because we have remotes that can click fast forward. Now, I think people, well, we've had for years, but people click fast forward or they DVR things, so they flip through the ads, as I know yours truly does. So I think it's so much harder for advertisers to make their mark today. And I find that people are getting so much on the bandwagon of you name it today, and everyone is supposed to be socially conscious, have a social consciousness in terms of their advertising, which again becomes like wallpaper. I just want to know about the product. So I think the industry just has changed so much. And like I said, a lot's gone online, a lot's just gone digital. I think there's an absence of ideas. And frankly, I've been out of the industry right now since 2016, and I haven't been following it. And so that's about all I can say about it, really.
Yeah, it's interesting because, with the influx of all these channels, on demand channels like Netflix, I realize, and I listen to podcasts, we don't watch regular broadcast TV. So it's jarring sometimes when I'm like in an
Yeah,
airport or at home and I'll catch a commercial. I'm like, oh, wow, they still make those. And it's just like, it's really weird because it's like a weird other world. And you could see
right.
the artificialness of what they're trying to do. And then like this, and I know, I mean, I was born in 1970, so I grew up like in with
Mhm.
all those commercials. I can sing the jingles, so
I can too,
Hungry
absolutely.
Hippo, and all the breakfast cereals, Lucky
Ab
Charms.
absolutely, and you know what? And it was part of popular culture, and that's talks to something else. There's 2 other points I wanna make here, and that's I think in some ways we've lost a lot of cultural cues, common cultural cues in this country because of the decentralization of media and of entertainment. Now, in and of itself, it's a good thing in the sense that there's more options, there are more choices. Witness the podcasting landscape, right? So that's great. However, these cultural cues that we all have right now, do you remember the whole Where's the Beef
Oh yeah,
campaign?
oh yeah.
Right? And you were to say, I think that I cannot think of a commercial right now. And even that everybody in this country would know. Even during, for example, the Super Bowl,
Yeah,
there's always a few standout commercials, and then they'll get some airplay afterwards.
yeah,
But again, to your point, if you're not watching legacy media, you're going to see them once on the Super Bowl, and then it's
yeah.
one and done. You'll talk about it the next day, and then boom, that's it. However, the interesting development also when it comes to communication and when it comes to product and getting the name of products out there is the use of, and I abhor this word, influencers.
Mm,
Okay. I don't like that word for a variety of reasons. But when you have product placement for certain people and brands think that just because XYZ person is using this product or touting the product or touting a location, for example, or
yeah,
an experience,
yeah.
therefore it's going to explode. I have very mixed feelings about that, actually, and its efficacy and its long term benefit to the brand. Because oftentimes for me, it's more about the quote unquote influencer than it is about the actual brand.
It reminds me of I listened to the episode you had with Stephen Kotler, and you talked about your time. I believe you went to Iran, and you made it a point not post photos because it was taking you out of the experience of being there present for that moment.
Well, I didn't post photos on that trip largely because I didn't take my laptop with me,
Yeah,
and I don't think I took technology with me.
yeah,
However, you're absolutely right, and thank you, first of all, for listening to my show.
yeah.
There are times where I don't post photo. Oh, no, maybe it was I was talking about Iraq actually,
Oh,
because
rock, okay. Yeah,
what I did though, I did post photos from Iraq, but that was because people were begging me
yes,
before I
that's right. You
went to
mentioned
please,
that. Yeah,
yeah, to please post it. But thank you for memory. But I have been to Iran
yeah.
actually also, and I didn't post there. I was there in 2007. But when I was in Iraq last year, it was there November 2022, I did just because, but I wasn't wild about it because I didn't want to be taken out of the moment that I was
Mm-hmm.
in.
Yeah,
And I think sometimes people like to post photos because they say, hey, look where I am. But for me, I'm going for myself. I'm not going because I want to impress
yeah,
anybody.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that just to kind of tie that thread together with the influencer, because you can see when it's like showing off perfectly placed and positioned photos, and you can tell they've got a camera team, and just like
Yeah.
you're sharing the experience. But I think to your benefit, what you get from being there, every little time you're distracted by well and good to take the photos, but then to just take the actual time to like post them or take 20, and you see people like posting in front of these marquees and things like that. So I think we're losing a lot of that, our ability to just stay in the present moment because of everything that's happening nowadays, and it's moving so fast.
I agree. And, even at the end of the day, when I'd go back to my room and I'd have a little bit of time, on some days I'd say, okay, I have enough energy to post. And on
Mm-hmm.
other days, I'd think, my gosh, this is such a slog, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, so as I mentioned to you before we started rolling, I'm going to Antarctica
yeah,
in a couple weeks as we record
yeah,
this. And so I'll be in Antarctica, the Falklands, South Georgia. I don't know what Wi-Fi is going to be like there. I am tempted, and I probably will post
yeah.
because there are a couple days at sea.
Okay,
And if we do have Wi-Fi and I'm just at sea
sure.
and I have 48
Yeah,
hours,
yeah.
to
Get caught
do
up.
whatever I want, that's okay. That's fine to do it for a little bit.
I'd be remiss if I didn't come back and ask where this passion for, first of all, Asia, China, because this seemed to have started early on. And do you recall, like, what was the trigger for that and where that passion was lit?
Sure. It really was when I was a kid. First, I come from a family of travelers. My
Yeah.
parents had traveled extensively
Okay.
overseas before people really started traveling. And so I think part of it is through them, part of it's genetic. But when I was a kid, when I was small, was the time that China was just opening up when Nixon went to China. And I remember seeing reporters starting to go to China and bringing back reports from this place that was just so alien
Yeah.
to anything that I ever could dream of. And I thought to myself, I really want to go there. And at a very early age, I knew that I wanted to study it and study Chinese. And so it's been a lifelong passion. Always been very interested, always been fascinated by non-Western cultures. And I was very
Mm.
fortunate to have teachers along the way that helped to feed my curiosity about these cultures through the coursework. And so that's how it really all started. That's how it all happened. And then, I've been very lucky to travel throughout Asia, in Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and so on, places people don't usually go. And for me, it's just been a great joy and truly a wonderful learning experience and an enriching experience. And going back to your very first question about this notion of self improvement, I don't go on trips because I'm in search of self improvement or I'm, trying to find myself or anything like that. But you can't walk away from going to another country that is so alien to your own country without making it a learning experience and without growing from that.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to Thailand, and it was truly like a shock to the senses in terms of no language. It didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard before. The colors were just so vibrant. Everything was just moving at a million miles an hour. And I remember it's one of the first times when I really felt like I was on another planet. Just
And it's
it
the
is a good
best feeling,
feeling.
isn't it?
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that feeling.
yeah. Is that what drives you to keep doing the traveling, to just continue to have that experience and to just be exposed to all these cultures?
I think it's a bunch of things, actually. I think that is number one of them. Just, I like the sensation of being in a place that is totally alien, totally foreign. I think for me, it's also a great sense of curiosity about these places. And I want to read between the headlines because I'm one of these people, if you give me something to read, I'm going to say, yeah, but. In other words, I want to question things and I want to see places for what they really are versus what a journalist with his or her bias is telling me about these places. And I just think I'm going to borrow from Susan Sontag, who said, living life abroad facilitates treating life as a spectacle.
Mm,
And I think you can change that to say, traveling abroad facilitates treating life as a spectacle. And it truly is. And it's the most remarkable experience to be able to befriend people in other countries that you would never, I mean, that have just vastly different experiences and vastly different life stories than yours, to be able to befriend them and to have a common language with them and to just enjoy each other's company. And that to me is just extraordinary. I mean, and the reality is I love different cultures. I love language.
yeah,
I love art.
yeah.
I love archaeology. I love
Mm,
history. And when you get to travel, you get to indulge in all of that.
very fun.
As I said, I'm very, very lucky to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Truly, I feel very blessed.
And I did connect with you on Instagram, so I'll be following your journey on your future travels.
But just know if I'm not posting, it
Yes,
doesn't mean that I'm not
that's right.
anywhere. It
That's right.
just means that I'm not posting. Right. So thank you for that.
So
Well, you
when,
can go back and see some of the previous posts
yeah,
that I
I'll
did. So
definitely do
hopefully you
that.
can enjoy them. Yeah.
So when you're in Singapore, you started the radio show, but connect the fact that you were working in advertising with the idea for starting a radio show.
Well, let's just say, so what happened was I had dabbled in radio previously
Sure.
when I was in high
Okay.
school, and one or two times when I was in China, people had asked me to do this or that on radio, and I loved the medium. I always had a love for the medium of
Mm-hmm.
radio.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a jazz program on one of the stations in Singapore, and I loved that show. And I said to one of my friend Cindy, I was like, and she knew everybody. I was like, hey, I really love that show. I was like, I really want to. I'm wondering if if they would like get me to host it. Can I host it? Can they rotate me on it? She's like, I'll introduce you to the program director. She introduced me to the program director. She said, send me a demo. I sent in a demo and that did it. And so they rotated me on the show. So it was from 8 to midnight, Saturdays and Sundays. So I usually got the Sunday shift, and then Monday morning, I was back in the office, and I got calls from my clients like, "Oh my gosh, Stephen, are you still there?" I was like, "Yeah, why?" They said, "Because we heard you on radio last night." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Anyway, and so then the station started a Latin music and lifestyle show, and this was the time, this was in, let's see, this was in '99.
Okay.
And when Latin music was, it was the whole Ricky Martin,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Copa de la Vida,
Yep.
a lot of his music was beginning to take off. Of course, Gloria Estefan,
Mark
her
Anthony.
music had been
Yep.
around, Mark Anthony,
Santana,
and so on,
Rebirth. Yeah.
Santana's Rebirth and so on. So there was this great love of them,
Yep.
but also all the Latin artists. So the station was starting the shows called Encuentro Latino on Gold 90 FM. Got to give them a shout out. And so I said, "Hey," I said, I said, "I know the music. I speak Spanish." I said, "Can I host the show?" And they said yes, and that's how it happened.
Where'd you learn to speak Spanish?
In high school, college, and then traveling through, Spain, Mexico, so on. At that point, and then subsequently, I've been to other Latin American countries.
Do you have a memorable song from your rotation that you would love to play?
Okay, so true confessions. I'm still listening to that same music. I mean, I listen to a lot of it still,
Yeah.
and in no particular order. I listen to Celia Cruz. I
Oh,
listen to
yeah.
Ricky. I listen to Luis
Yeah, of
Miguel,
course. Yeah.
Alejandro Sanz from Spain. I
Mm-hmm.
listen to, God, who else do I listen to? I do listen to a lot of Mark Anthony's
Mm-hmm.
old stuff.
Yeah.
I was playing Shakira before she became Shakira. In other
That's
words,
great.
when she was big in Colombia, but she
Yeah.
was not known in the English-speaking world. And I really prefer her old stuff.
Mm.
But I can't even begin to tell you because it depends on the mood. I listen to a lot of tangos. I
Yeah.
listen to salsa. I
Yeah.
listen to, you name it. I listen to it all. And I still listen to that music. And in fact, I was listening to Luis Miguel right before we came on.
That's great. So I'm Salvadorian. I was born in El Salvador.
Were you?
Yeah, so my
Oh, I didn't know that.
parents brought me here when I was a year old. So I grew up in Latin culture, and in New York, it's more of the Puerto Rican, the
And the
merengue,
Dominican,
yeah,
the
Dominican
Dominican
mix,
music, yeah.
and then my ex-wife was Colombian, so I got introduced to that whole genre of music,
Vallenato and so on.
vallenatos, yeah, and then we had been to Argentina, so I have a love for tango
Oh, I
music as
love
well. So
tango.
just a mix of everything, and when you start to see the genres mixing and different sounds coming out of it, it's always holds a special place in my heart for that as well.
You and me both. And, I love the music of Colombia because there's a singer. Do you know who Charlie Za is?
Yeah, yeah,
He's an older Charlie Za. A couple of his tunes I listen to like over and
yeah,
over and
yeah.
over. And
Yeah.
Grupo Nietzsche,
Grupo
Grupo
Nietzsche, yeah,
Nietzsche.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, they're an old group, from
Yeah,
Cali. Gotas de Lluvia,
yeah,
that song. I
yeah,
won't
yeah,
sing
yeah.
it for you. I listen to all of that stuff still. I know it's crazy for a gringo like me to be listening to this stuff,
No, I
but
know you're very well versed, and I'm surprised you should probably put together a Spotify playlist of your favorite songs. And
I have had people ask me
okay,
for playlists, and the funny thing is, I recorded most of my shows
yeah.
on Encuentro Latino on cassettes, and I still
Oh
have them.
wow,
And I need to send them somewhere
yeah.
to have them digitized because the music was, yeah,
Now, if you get
it
that
was great.
playlist going, we'll add it to the show notes by the time the episodes go live. We'll share it.
Do you want me to do one?
Yeah, please. That would be
Just like a total random.
total random Latin music
Okay.
favorites. That'd be
Like
so much
10,
fun. Yeah,
15,
yeah, yeah,
20.
yeah,
Yeah, I'll do that
yeah.
for you. Yeah.
Those are so much fun. So
Yeah.
I appreciate the listener for being patient for the journey we've been on so far, because they're like, I thought we were going to talk about a podcast, and then I think just
Yes.
telling the story of how you've gotten here, and then you mentioned early on how you got, you're doing the show and you got the idea for the one way ticket,
The
and,
one way
and
ticket show.
the one way ticket show, the
Show.
podcast. So
Yeah.
what was your relationship or your understanding of what a podcast was at the time, and what were you thinking it would be? Did you have a plan? Were you working with someone, or talk about those early days? Because we did mention this.
You're looking at the guy that I was working with. I knew that there was this thing called a podcast, and I thought, I want to get this show up and running. And so I came to New York. I knew like five people. And so I waited a bunch of years because I thought to myself, well, podcasting wasn't a thing in 2006, or maybe it was, but anyway. And so I waited to, get a critical mass of interesting people that I could interview. So I had my first six, and by a whole series of happenstance, which I won't go into because it's too long of a story, I met someone who's an editor. And I'm not, as I told you at the beginning of the show before we started rolling, there's high tech, low tech, and there's me. So I was not going to edit the show. So I have an editor, Miratone Studios. which I've been using since day one. I adore them. Anyone that wants to use them, please reach out to me because I'll be happy to make an intro. And they've been editing all my shows ever since. So it was just Jay from Miratone, Jay and Roman, the other co-owner, and their series of editors, and myself. So it's been me. It's like Louis XIV said, I am the state, l'été c'est moi. Well, I am the podcast. And so I've had to do everything. Now, however many years on, it'll be 12 years in March of 2023. I'm at the point where I'm saying, I really can't do it anymore myself. I
Mm,
need PR. I need my social media team. I
yeah.
need it all because I can't do it all. Why? Because I not only do the one way ticket show, which we can talk about what the premise of the show is, but in addition to that, I also produce and host the Israelcast podcast for a wonderful organization called Jewish National Fund, which has been around now since 1901. So if my math is correct, that's 122 years.
Wow.
And we feature up really cool stuff going on in Israel: science, technology, innovation, the culinary arts, because Israel is a foodie paradise. More
Mm-hmm.
vegans in Israel per capita than anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
Archaeology, you name it. So I also produce and host that show. And I produce the What's Burning podcast for the Galilee Culinary Institute, which is a new culinary center being built in Kiryat Shmona in Israel's northeast Galilee region. So I have a lot of plates. So I am very embedded in the podcast world because I'm like living, breathing, eating, sleeping, everything else in podcasting. So there you go. So that's the thing. So for me, doing the one way ticket show, it's a love, it's a passion, but I'm really at the point now where I really need, the assistance to grow it
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm very happy with it because on the show, I'll share the premise of the
Yeah,
show.
please do.
I explore with my guests where they'd go if given a one way ticket, no coming back. Their destinations can be in the past, present, future, real, imaginary, or state of mind. We also chat about their life, their work, and any projects or books that they have. I'm a stickler for doing my homework. If the guest has a new book out, I read it cover to cover because I prepare. My big thing about preparation, because I know there's a lot of podcasters that don't prepare, and I appreciate that you've prepared for this conversation. There are a lot that don't, and frankly, shame on them because I think it's very disrespectful. It's disrespectful to the guest to show that you don't care enough about them to prepare. It's disrespectful to the listeners because if you don't prepare, you're not going to get the best out of your guests.
Yeah.
And if the guest is constantly asked a question on in other interviews, you don't want to ask the same thing. You want to
Yeah.
ask something different. And frankly, it's disrespectful to me because I want to do the best that I can do and I want to be the best that I can be. Okay, so I do a lot of preparation. I've had some amazing guests throughout the years. Everyone from general, and the funny thing is, people say, "Oh, well, who have you had and who are the famous people?" And I give them a list, and they're like, "Oh, I haven't heard of that person." And one thing I've realized is that is famous means something different
Oh, yeah.
to different famous means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can tell you I've had General David Petraeus on, or I've had Dick Cavett on, who, if you don't know who Dick Cavett is, shame on you and look him up. I had Anne Margaret on recently, and if
Yeah.
you don't know who she is, look her up.
Yep.
I've had on former U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman. I've had on CBS News co-host Tony DeCopel,
Yeah.
or I've had on, John Dickerson from 60 Minutes, or, who else have I had on that's famous? I'm just trying to think. I've had a lot of well-known people on my show. I've had New York Mayor Eric
I saw
Adams when
that.
he was
Yeah.
Brooklyn Borough President. That was a really just wonderful interview, and on and on. So I've had a lot of well-known people. Some people are not well known, but they're all at the top of their game.
Yeah.
And for me, it's all about bringing their stories and making people look at what travel can mean in a different light because again their destinations can be past, present, future, real, imaginary, or state of mind. And the other thing that I really try and do with my show, and I appreciate what you're doing with your show, it's long form conversation because I think we've lost the art of conversation
Yeah.
today
I
because
agree.
everything is about, and I'm lifting up my phone for those that are looking on video,
Yeah.
everything is about text and everything is about the soundbite, and people have no time to explain. And it's going back to something also I said earlier on, is that people like to look at things in very black and white terms, but everything I think in life is very nuanced. And when you can get to hear somebody and you can hear their point of view or have them share information without the interruptions of a commercial or of a host that is trying to show more of what they know rather than what the guest wants to share,
Mm,
it can be very, very irritating. I just have to give you a shout out because I think you are a wonderful host because you let a guest speak.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I was intrigued by your conversation with Anne Margaret, so I gave that one a listen too. And I'm curious when you think about all the work that you put into preparing for a conversation, what's your
Mhm.
thought process when you have this information in front of you? If you're doing it yourself, your research team is pulling these bits, and with someone like Anne who's been around for so long and has got so much you can pull from, you've got a limited amount of time, especially with these high profile guests. Can you talk a little bit about your thought process or how you go through this information and you curate, what it is that you're going to pull from this information so that you can formulate the questions that you want to ask?
Well, first of all, I have to correct you and say I don't have a research team.
Okay.
Again, you're looking at the research team. So the research team is a team of one, and his name is Stephen. Well, what I usually do, it's a little bit of research and it's a little bit of magic more than
Mm,
anything else, because what I do is I try, let's just take Anne Margaret, for
sure.
example. I tried to listen to as many interviews as she gave as possible.
Yeah.
And again, for any listener that doesn't know who Anne Margaret is, I'm joking when I say shame on you, but Google who
Yeah.
she is and you'll know who she is.
A lot of
So,
Minnesotans would probably know her from Grumpy Old Men. So.
okay, but listen, they'll know her from
Yeah.
co-starring with Betty Davis and
Yes.
John
Yeah.
Wayne and Elvis in Viva Las Vegas and
EP.
Jack
EP.
Nicholson.
EP to
E-
her.
that's right, EP, and you name it, and everybody who is anybody over the
Yeah.
last, since the mid 1950s, or excuse me, the early 1960s. George Burns discovered her.
Mm,
She performed in USO shows with Bob Hope in Vietnam, and the list just goes on. I tried to look at as many interviews as she gave as possible. And from there, I start to wonder, and I started to ask questions that I wanted to know that either the interviewer did not delve into more
mm,
or that I just happened to want to know. So sometimes questions just pop into my head. As I mentioned about travel and why I love to travel, one of the reasons being I'm curious. Again, you have to be curious to be able to do interviews, okay? And so that was one thing that I did. The other thing that I wanted to make sure, and I do this with as many guests as I can that have done interviews, I want to see their interviews because I want to know the cadence of how they answer questions.
mm.
Because in her case, she puts the charm in charming, and I adore this woman, and I so cannot wait to meet her in person. Yet she is not a chatty Cathy, as they say,
Yeah.
right? She gives an answer and she gives it from the heart, and
Yes.
then that's it. And then you're ready for the next question. So I knew that was the way that she answered questions. The other thing is, and this is in no particular order, by the way, is that I wanted to be very sensitive. And why do I mean by this? Because she did have a relationship with Elvis, or as she says, EP, or she
Yeah.
called him EP.
Yeah.
She did have a relationship, and I did not want to go there with her
Sure.
because I did not think it was appropriate. I did see one interviewer do that with her. And I thought
Mm,
it was so inappropriate the way that he was kind of hammering after her.
yeah.
And I thought, excuse me, you are a very high paid interviewer and very well known. I don't want to say who it was. And I thought you really needed to lay off her because clearly she was uncomfortable. The
Yeah.
last thing that I want to do as a host is to make my guests uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I want to make them feel like they're in my home,
Yeah.
they've come into my living room, and we're having a chat. One thing that Dick Cavett, the famed talk show host, told me that Jack Parr, who was the first host of The Tonight Show,
Yeah.
taught him was make it a conversation.
Yeah.
And I like to make it as much of a conversation as possible. And so I hope I'm answering your question
Yeah.
by
Of
saying
course.
I try and look at as many interviews as possible. I try and read up as much as possible. The other thing that I like to do is to explore areas that nobody else has asked. And if someone else has touched on a particular topic, I like to take a different approach to it or a
Mm-hmm.
different angle. And I also like to make things personal without making them intrusive, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So, for example, with Anne Margaret, she and I both went to the same high
Yes,
school,
that's
New
right.
Trier High School, which we
Yeah.
spoke about, which was just
She
so
even
much
sang
fun.
the song, I believe.
Well, she sang the song to you. Thank you for
Yeah.
listening. She sang the Northwestern fight song,
Okay.
right? Which is what it was. She sang the Northwestern fight song, but for our New Trier High School, I wanted to ask her about it. So I wanted to ask her about it in a rather personal way
Yeah.
and in a different way versus just tell me what it was like going to New Trier High School, right? So I brought in her drama coach,
Yeah,
who,
that's
how
right.
did I know who her drama coach was? Because I did my homework
Yep.
and I went on YouTube and I saw Anne Margaret, This Is Your Life, and her drama coach was one of those that came on
Mm,
that show.
yeah.
So I was able to make it very personal for her. and to touch that within her without making it intrusive or personal on a very unfriendly level.
I think what you've done in the few interviews that I've listened to, it's this fine dance between asking a provoking question that gets a thoughtful response, but also being respectful of making sure you don't go where the guest doesn't want to go. And there's some
Yes.
subjects in there that were interesting and maybe touchy for her, especially around her time in Vietnam. And there was a point where I think she didn't want to answer something specifically about an experience there.
Yes, being on the front lines. I
Yeah,
said, and seeing, like, is there anything, I think I might have asked her, was there anything that she saw that she wanted
yeah,
to? And she's like, I'd rather not talk about it.
yeah,
And I respected that.
yeah,
And I was like, I was totally cool with that.
yeah.
So that was as far as I would go with something like that. But, the other thing is the flip side to all of it, because that to me was just such a joy of an interview on so many levels to do. And I don't know if you're in the same, but I have as much enjoyment out of researching as I
Yeah,
do doing the
yeah,
interview,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I can tell you right now, anything you want to know about Ann Margaret, I can tell you because I've done, I've done the homework and it's a joy to do that. And to go back to your question about how then do you take this information and then distill it? Because usually my interviews they turn out to be about 50-ish minutes to
Mm-hmm.
an hour, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, hers, I was only given about 30 minutes
Mm.
to do. I
Okay.
think something like that. So
Okay.
I always have more information than I know what to do with.
Yeah.
And I have it in front of me, and I have all my questions or areas that I want to touch on in front of me. And for me, I always know that there are the couple that I really want to get
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
and then everything else can kind of come into place. But I always know that there are going to be things that a guest says that will precipitate more questions,
Mm.
and I want them to expand on. The other thing that I always know is that there's an arc to the show. And this, for any podcaster that is anyone that's thinking about doing a podcast or as a podcaster, you really need to have an arc for the show.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like, so for example, with Ann Margaret, I wasn't going to talk about her years at New Trier High School at the very beginning, although I think she wanted to go there. But I wanted to talk about that at the end to close it. And so I knew what my arc was going to be, so I could lead the witness, so to speak, in that case. I must also interject with something else, though, that I think is instructive for
Yes.
podcasters as well as for those interested in doing a podcast. And as we talk about not treading on certain subjects or
Mm-hmm.
not making it too personal or making someone feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
By the same token, there are things that I won't necessarily bring up with certain guests if I think that they will think that it's too frivolous,
Mm.
although I might look at it as rather lighthearted.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay. And there were certain things I wanted to ask. For example, General David Petraeus, who was, if our listeners aren't familiar with him, he was the head of the CIA, he was the head of our forces
Mm-hmm.
in Iraq, and so
Mm-hmm.
on, and a real imposing figure,
Yeah.
but a very, very nice gentleman.
Yeah.
He's a real officer and a gentleman,
Got
right?
it.
And just a wonderful man. And I approached him for an interview through his office, and he very graciously gave me an hour of his time. And there were certain things that I wanted to ask him about, but I held back because I thought to myself, it's not really in keeping with the tone of the interview.
Yeah.
And I don't want him to look at this as sort of a frivolous conversation.
Yeah.
So I held back and I didn't go there with him. I would love to have him back. And now that I've had him in conversation with already, I may go there with him. But again, it's a trust that you have to build up with some guests. And certain guests are very quick with that.
Yeah.
And then other guests, it's sort of by the end of the interview, they know that you're legitimate and so on and so forth. I had a wonderful interview with Jay Johnson, for example, who was our former Homeland Security Secretary. And he's a great guest because he actually has his own jazz show.
Okay.
He's gone back to practicing law. He has his own jazz show on radio. And so we wanted to talk about that and so many other things. So with him, I could sort of press those kinds of
Yeah.
buttons, right? Because we had developed that rapport already during our conversation.
I love the stance that you have with your guest and part of it to ensure that success is obviously all the work you've done ahead of time to make sure you know what you're going to talking about. But you're also listening because there's opportunities to pull threads. Sometimes they'll mention something, and so I know as me as a listener, I'm like, "Oh, I wonder if he's going to go down that little door that was open there." So how do you manage that dance and deciding, how do I keep to, I guess going off script versus deciding what I committed to as part of my plan for this episode?
Yeah, what I usually do is if there's a thread there, but I want to move on,
Yeah.
I'll say to them, I want to touch on that in just a moment, but
Okay.
first, and then I touch on something else, and then I'll go back to it because sometimes that little opening, that little door opening, as you just called it, is a nugget of something that I do want to ask later
Mm.
on. So that happens a lot.
Yeah.
So then I'm able to say, and I'm able to tie that in together.
Yeah.
So you have to really be a very good listener because
Yeah.
I've listened to certain podcasts or certain people, and I've heard them. It's question, 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 question. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired listening to this. Have the
Yeah.
conversation. There is a time and place, though, for question, question, question.
Yeah.
If you're on the news,
Yes.
and it's a 30-minute news show and you've got someone for 4 minutes or whatever it is, you got to get those questions in. That's clear. But in this wonderful medium of podcasting where it is long form
Yeah.
and you don't want to go on for 12 hours, you know when the length is right and you know about when the time
Yeah.
is right
Yeah. Yeah.
to close shop. But having said that, though, is that you want to be able to listen and you want to be able to pick up on those threads. Absolutely.
My girlfriend likes to say judgment and curiosity cannot exist in the same space. So I'm always conscious of that as I'm having these conversations. Like I'd rather be more curious, about all the things that you've spoken about today.
Can I borrow that?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Judgment and curiosity cannot exist in the same place. By the way, it's also a danger when you're going back to edit the episode, because for your
Yeah.
listeners,
Yeah.
for our listeners here
Yeah.
now, I mean, I'll listen back and I'll edit. I keep all questions and answers, but sometimes if the guest has to cough or if yours
Sure.
truly does, and I'm surprised I haven't had to cough once during our
Yeah.
conversation, having done all the talking almost now.
Knock on wood.
Yes, knock on wood, fingers crossed. I'll sometimes go back and I'll think, oh my gosh, why didn't I ask
Yeah.
X, Y, and
I
Z,
know. There's always that.
But there's always that. However, here's another point, pro tip for podcasters or people wanting to do it, is that keep all of your questions, keep all of the research because you sometimes, not sometimes, but oftentimes you want to do a round two. In other
Mm.
words, I sometimes don't like to give it all away during the first interview. I do want to keep some things for the second interview. And Margaret is a perfect example. I mean, I could have asked her about 5 top celebs that she worked with, and
Mm.
I didn't because I wanted to keep something. I asked her about Betty Davis,
Yeah.
Bob Hope, and Elvis, and John Wayne.
Yeah.
That was the last one. And I had a few others there, but I thought, you know what? There's too many other things to talk about.
Yeah.
Let me keep it for another time.
I may have to do the same here. I
Okay.
could talk to you for another hour, I'm sure, especially when we're talking shop here. How have you grown as a host over the years?
Wow. I think you'd have to ask the listeners more than me, I suppose. But I think the one thing is, I think if you do it long enough, I mean, you've had over 300
Yeah.
odd episodes, right?
Yeah.
I'm almost at the 300 mark. And for Israel Cast, we've done 177.
Wow.
So you do the math,
Yep.
okay? And so I think as a host, I think it's a sense of confidence having done it more and more
Yeah.
and more. I find that just overall confidence. And I think early on, I was afraid to interject my personality into the show. And it's interesting because when I was on radio, one of the program directors said, Stephen, people want to learn more about you and people want your personality and they want that. So don't, feel free to open up. And I did on radio.
Yeah.
When I started the podcast, I didn't want to make it all about me
Yeah.
because I think there's that danger for the host to do that. And I was so cautious about doing that, I almost didn't interject anything
Yeah.
about me. And then now I'll interject a little bit more. I will. I'll do that. So I feel more comfortable doing that. So I
Yeah.
think that's probably how I've grown.
Yeah, it comes with time. So, just a
Yeah,
couple of questions as we wrap up here that I like
sure.
to ask my guests. What's something that you've changed your mind about recently?
Okay. So I think it's going to have to do with nutrition. And this is I know that we're winding down the show.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a question that you're going to have to, how's this for a tease? And how's this for an invite to have a part two with Stephen? But I will say, jokes aside, it has to do with certain nutritional approaches and questions I think I've changed my mind about recently over the last several months, given a whole variety of reasons.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. What do you think the most misunderstood thing is about you?
Probably my politics.
Okay. We can leave those there as
How's that
yeah,
for being mysterious?
very mysterious. Well, Stephen, I really enjoyed this conversation. I was really looking forward to it, and especially really admire everything you've done for being a spokesperson for podcasting, being a pioneer in podcasting, starting way back in 2012 when people were scotch taping Skype or whatever it was that back then to get some of these things recorded. I myself was using Skype with call recorder, and it was a bit of the Wild West back then. And you've done such a great job with the show. It's very inspiring, and for anyone who's getting into podcasting, specifically with interview-based format, I think they'll learn a lot. And it's clear when you think about that nugget of you way back having an interest in international broadcast journalism and then understanding like your interest in PR. It's so fascinating to watch all the pieces come together, your love of China and different cultures. You've brought everything together, and it's very apparent in your conversations and in the wide range of guests how you're just pursuing your creativity and your curiosity, and you're bringing the listener along on the ride, and which is really fascinating because I always say in a podcast conversation there's three people: the host, the guest, and the listener, singular listener, because there's one person listening at a time. And what you do is really paint this really wonderful theater of the mind for your listener. And so I really want to just take a moment to say thank you for everything you've been doing, and congratulations on all the success you've had with the show.
Well, super thank you, first of all, for those very kind words, and definitely right back at you for doing all you're doing to promote this wonderful medium that is podcasting. And this has been just such a great joy and fun to join you on your program. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Where's the best place for folks to connect with you in the show?
They can come to my apartment here on the Upper West Side. I
Some,
have a nice living room. They
yeah,
can sit on the sofa and watch me.
I'll be there next time I'm in town. So
Please do. Please do. I'd love to have you here.
yeah,
They can definitely get me at, well, first of all, the show is the One Way Ticket Show. So
yeah.
I really hope that people check it out at theonewayticketshow.com. So theonewayticketshow.com, or they can search for the One Way Ticket Show wherever they get their podcasts. And follow me on all social media at Stephen Shalowitz, Stevens with a V, at Stephen Shalowitz. Or folks can write to me at Stephen at theonewayticketshow.com. So that's Stephen at theonewayticketshow.com. Find me on social media, and would really love to just connect with all of your wonderful listeners. And really, again, thanks to everybody for listening, and really thanks to you for allowing me to chat with you today. This was a really lovely way of spending an afternoon.
Thanks again, Stephen. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thank you.